Good afternoon, everybody. In the interests of keeping to the time schedule, we'll kick off this third parallel session. So you're all very welcome to this session on how do we account for natural capital and biodiversity. We have 4 speakers in this session. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, set the scene. Then we have 4 speakers, and then at the end hopefully we'll still have time for discussion, for questions. Remember, you can submit questions online, and they will come up at the end, and we'll deal with them then. So the question is, how do we account for natural capital and biodiversity? And I guess the first thing to do is to set the scene. Thank you. Is why? Why do we want to account for natural capital and biodiversity? Well, one reason is it's one of the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 15.9, by 2020, so by next year, integrate ecosystems and biodiversity values into national and local planning, development processes, poverty reduction strategies, and accounts. So integrating ecosystems and biodiversity into national accounts is something that we are striving to do in order to deliver on the development goals. It's also in our National Biodiversity Action Plan. So to develop a natural capital asset register and national natural capital accounts, but again by 2020. And one of the actions in the National Biodiversity Plan is to initiate accounting through projects using this UN system of experimental ecosystem accounting, SEEA or SEEA. And several of our speakers today are going to talk about SEEA, so I'm just going to introduce it very briefly. It's a UN system for environmental economic accounting. It's a framework that integrates economic and environmental data to provide a more comprehensive and multi-purpose view of the interrelationships between economy and the environment, and the stocks and the changes in stocks of environmental assets and the benefits that they bring to humanity. And the framework covers 4 types of environmental economic accounts, shown on the left here. And on the right here is how these accounts link to one another, so how the elements of these accounts link to each other. So we've got environmental flow accounts to do with water, energy and emissions, natural resource accounts to do with timber, fish, minerals, generally the things that can be monetized. We have environmental transactions in the dark blue there at the bottom. These are to do with environmental taxes and subsidies, expenditure, green jobs, green economy. And we have the ecosystem assets and services, which is the land, the soils, the biodiversity. And this is really the new area from the statistical point of view. And the whole point of this framework is that we can produce internationally comparable statistics and accounts. And the framework follows similar accounting structures to the system of national accounts. So we can integrate environmental and economic information into our national accounts. So it's really quite a radical change to the way that we do our national accounting and finances. So just before I hand over to our 4 fantastic speakers, who I'm very excited to hear from, I'm just going to mention a project that we're just about to start. So a new project that will develop natural capital accounting in Ireland. We've called it INCASE, and it's funded by the Environmental Protection Agency. It kicks off next month. We're looking forward to the journey over the next 4 years. These are the 4 main objectives of the project, so to review accounting processes and to create a framework for application in Ireland, to develop catchment-based approaches to developing accounts and develop some accounts at the catchment level, see what the challenges are, see what the data gaps are, and to develop these ecosystem accounts and environmental flow accounts. And to develop some economic tools, so tools for decision makers, and conduct some economic impact assessments. So it's a collaborative project involving Trinity, UCD, UL, NUIG, the Forum, and the IDEA group, which is the group that has developed the SEEA framework. It's also a multidisciplinary group. I find myself talking about economics and accounting, and I really don't know nearly enough about them. So I'm an ecologist. I'm working with economists and socio-economists in order that we can cut across the disciplines, because this is what we need in order to further this area. We haven't started yet, so I'm going to hand over to people who know, I think, quite a lot more about this than me. Our first speaker I'd like to introduce is Luke McGrath, who is a PhD candidate in economics at NUIG, funded through the Irish Research Council, and he's going to talk us about natural capital accounting using a genuine savings mechanism. So, Luke, thank you.
Yes, so thanks for that, Jane. So I'm basically presenting an exercise that we undertook in green macroeconomic accounting. So essentially this involves making adjustments to the conventional national accounts to reflect changes in the value of the Irish natural capital stock. And then by making a number of other adjustments as well as some strong assumptions, genuine savings actually serves as an indicator of sustainable development from an economic perspective. Okay, so economic theory attempts to operationalize the rather vague concept of sustainable development using a so-called capital approach. So an economy is defined as sustainable if it's capable of providing non-declining well-being or welfare through time. So this can be achieved if the correctly valued comprehensive wealth of the economy, which is all of those productive assets that provide us with well-being or welfare, i.e. the various capital stocks, are maintained for future generations. This forces us to broaden our conception of capital beyond the traditional physical view of buildings and machinery, and to look at nature as a valuable asset that's worth maintaining. There's an environmental debate over the exact conditions required to achieve sustainability, so economists generally ascribe to weak sustainability where the focus is on maintaining and enhancing some total aggregate capital stock, whereas ecologists are more likely to be focused on strong sustainability, which is a stronger constraint of maintaining some overall aggregate level of natural capital in and of itself. Okay, so how might we go about measuring sustainability? So the UN offers this sort of dashboard approach with lots of highly valuable indicators, but given that economic perspective, the theory suggests really we should be looking at comprehensive wealth. So genuine savings provides a theoretically correct indicator of sustainable development as it attempts to measure annual changes in comprehensive wealth. So we calculate genuine savings by starting from the conventional national accounts, the gross national savings, and then making deductions for the depreciation or depletion of our natural capital stock, our traditional or physical capital stock, and then adding in estimates of human capital accumulation. Persistently negative genuine savings provide a signal that the economy is failing to provide its ability to maintain future generations with well-being. The World Bank has very much taken on the mantle of genuine savings and provides estimates for most countries in the world, including Ireland, but its focus is on comparability and consistency, and this leads to a number of inevitable limitations. So these include a reliance on highly aggregated international data, as well as a limited coverage of pollution damages. So our contribution was to focus on Ireland, which allowed us to extend the number of pollutants covered and to look at some country-specific factors like peat depletion that aren't covered by the World Bank. This led us to two key research questions. So firstly, does addressing these limitations lead to any sizable difference from the World Bank estimates? And we find that it does. And secondly, during this period, so 1990 to 2016, Ireland went through rapid economic development and a subsequent decline. So what was the impact of that within this GS framework? So this is what's included in our broader measures of capital. So we have a paper currently undergoing revisions to be resubmitted to the Ecological Economics Journal that goes into how we calculate all this stuff. But just in short, natural capital is including a bundle of renewable and non-renewable subsoil assets. We're including pollution damages as a form of negative natural capital, and we're estimating human capital accumulation using two different methods. And we get to three headline GS measures, so GS1, GS2 and GS3, and this just reflects the high variability in the estimated marginal damage costs of pollution from the literature. So this is the estimated damage as a result of an additional tonne of a pollutant being emitted. So GS1 is taking those highest values from the literature, GS3 is taking the lowest ones. So we put all of this stuff together, so what did we find? So essentially, Celtic tiger growth from the mid-1990s nor the economic downturn appear to have coincided with unsustainable development. We find some signal of unsustainability in our GS1 measure, where we've got those higher environmental damages in the early 90s, and then some evidence of the economy actually transitioning away from this unsustainable path during the economic boom. So those three measures are narrowing through time as environmental damages are falling throughout this entire period. The fact that, in relation to the World Bank estimates, ours are consistently lower. So the World Bank, particularly at the beginning of the period, where the bank are estimating a savings rate of about 15 to 20% of GNI, where our results are indicating it's somewhere between -3 and 10%. And the fact we're finding negative savings for a developed economy in any scenario is really rare within the GS literature. So typically developed economies only have negative savings during periods like the two world wars or as a result of volatile resource prices. Our results are actually driven by pollution damages. So if we focus on the GS1 measure, there's a bar chart on the left. So the green bar is environmental damages. So in the early 90s, that's representing about negative 20% of national income. So that's what's turning the savings negative. Then from 1995, we get this decade of strong real economic growth. That blue bar starts increasing. That's the conventional net investment is going up. And then at the same time, environmental damages are falling. So this is another significant finding, because typically economies transitioning away from an unsustainable path generally just grow net investments, the conventional net investment, enough to offset rising environmental damages, where our results are showing an economy having rapid economic development and rapid declines in environmental damages concurrently. So a big story here is those remarkable declines in environmental damages, as illustrated by the graph there on the right. So as a percentage of national income, across the three measures, they've fallen in half by the year 2000, fallen in half again by 2006, and yet again before the end of the period. Even in absolute terms and constant prices, the three measures have all been cut in half. So what was going on here? Focusing again on GS1, it's all about that orange component getting smaller. That's sulfur dioxide emissions. So that's fallen by about 93% over the period, from about 144,000 kilotons to 14. That's largely reflecting the switch to cheaper, cleaner natural gas in electricity generation. So most of the pollutants there have fallen rapidly over that period. Only carbon dioxide and NH3, which is ammonia emissions, have gone up. They're both heavily influenced by agriculture. And these results are showing the sizable potential benefits from pollution reduction. So there in constant prices, air pollution damages were estimated there at about €9 billion in 1990, down to about €4.5 billion in 2016. It's also illustrating that it's not just about one particular problem. So it's not just carbon dioxide emissions, there are these other highly damaging pollutants that should also be accounted for. In terms of limitations of the work, so the paper goes into a lot of detail here. I'll just mention the biggest one, which is clearly we're not valuing everything, and what we are valuing relies on market values. So we go into detail in the paper about how we're likely to be severely underestimating peat depletion, at least explicitly, because we're not capturing biodiversity loss, damage to habitats, that carbon storage. So there's a large literature suggesting government policies led to an exploitation or an over-exploitation of our peat resources, but it's not explicitly showing up in our figures. We are capturing the damage from the burning of peat implicitly in our pollution damages, but there are those other factors that we're missing out on. And then in terms of conclusions, so our key policy implication is in relation to sustainable development indicator sets. So typically these indicator sets include an economy component, and that targets GDP growth or GDP per capita. But actually the economic theory suggests it's comprehensive wealth rather than gross domestic product that we should be looking at. And that's because in those conventional accounts, that GDP measure, natural capital depletion can only account for a positive impact. So there's no offsetting depreciation measure going in, which is why we have to make these green adjustments. And as well, this work as well highlights the lack of historical data that we have on our natural assets. So there's loads of stuff that we'd love to be including in this analysis, like soil degradation, stuff from fisheries, etc., but the data just simply doesn't exist. So it's highly encouraging to see the work of the INCASE project, as well as the ecosystem service mapping done by the National Parks and Wildlife, and the other stuff we're going to hear from the other speakers. So hopefully this can all feed into better indicators and measures and let us get a handle on our natural assets, because the conventional national accounts just aren't designed to capture natural capital at all. Okay, so thanks.
Thank you very much, Luke, and also thanks for being perfectly keeping to time. So we will take questions at the end. If you have questions for Luke, please make a note of them or submit them via the Slido system, or just remember them, and we'll move on to our next speaker. So our second speaker this afternoon is Catherine Farrell, who's the chief ecologist. Sorry, I told you the two went together. Catherine isn't an economist, she's an ecologist.
Called many things.
At Board and Mona. Catherine, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
So I don't know about you, but my eyes were glazing over in the last presentation, so I'm definitely not an economist. Look, it's great to be here today. I'm just going to perch that up there. So why am I here? So I'm going to just talk about our approach to natural capital accounting, give you a bit of information on what it has involved for us and how we feel the whole process is going. And then I guess, I know I don't have enough time, so I'm just going to sort of talk about how it might be used and the benefits. So I guess here's the picture of Board and Mona in 2028, and I suppose from the round of applause in the room this morning, peat burning is not a popular activity, and it's not my place here to discuss the time frame, but it will be winding down gradually over the next 5 years. And the world that we see in 2028 will be a very different one. The Board and Mona won't be relying on peat production, but what's really interesting for the people in this room, I hope primarily, is the transformation that will bring us into this wonderful new landscape of fens, wetlands and woodlands, and yeah, there may be a little bit of peat production, and there certainly will be renewable energy projects, but I guess the point here is there are going to be massive changes in land use across the Midlands bog areas, and I guess how that links in with the surrounding lands as well is also an important piece for us to be taking into consideration. So why are we doing this? Again, look, Jane covered all the pieces that it's mentioned in the National Biodiversity Action Plan, but also we have about 3 actions in our own Biodiversity Action Plan. We were one of the founding members of the Forum on Natural Capital, and I suppose what drove it for me when myself and Jane and Paddy Woodworth and Declan Little got together to, have that first meeting was we need to bring nature into the conversation. So I'm working in a world where there's lots of talk about finance and budgets and what's the value for this and what's the value of doing all this wonderful rehab, Catherine. So this is about bringing that into the conversation so that we know as ecologists, or those ecologists that are here, that when you restore a habitat or you rehabilitate, you reinstate all of those ecosystem goods and services like water filtration, water attenuation, the big spongy bogs to absorb all the water, slowing it down, moving into the sorry, I'm recognizing loads of people in the audience as I go around. It's about just trying to recognize that, okay? So, listen, what do? We fortuitously, having watched for a while, okay, to see what methods people were using. So Quilch were doing stuff, and Craig Bullock is here, he's done a lot of natural capital accounting stuff. We were saying, well, let's wait, bide our time and see what's going to be the right approach. And fortuitously, we met with Carl Obst of the IDEA group, and he's the author of this SCIA approach. And we met them, seemed like a really nice guy. We could talk plainly and simply, and we decided we'll go with a 2-phase approach with this, right? That the first phase being a feasibility study. Look, all communities know a feasibility study is like the first thing you do, and we're sick of feasibility studies, but we had to do a feasibility study to see, did we have the right information? Could this be translated across the bogs? Could we work together? Because these guys are based in Australia, and I wasn't going to be getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning to have the Skype calls at that time. So it's all that sort of stuff. So we've considered the options. Is it feasible? We've decided it is, so we're moving into phase 2. And how can we do this? So this is the basis for the CM model, right? So okay, you own land. You're Bord and Mona, you're the OPW, you're Dublin Port Authority. You own land. So first of all, you've got an asset register. Okay, so we've got to translate that into whatever language we want to talk about. So we know that in our rehabilitation, the lands are reverting to fen, woodland, peatland habitat. So what's the extent of the asset? So it's all about mapping. Then what's the condition, right? So you have a bog that's been rehabilitated 10 years ago. It's in a fen. Is it a pioneer fen, or is it becoming an established fen? So it's about what is the condition of that asset, okay? So once you have all that done, you can then start talking about, well, if this is a functional fen, or if this is a functional bog, it's an active raised bog. If it's an active raised bog, it must be sequestering carbon. It's providing, is it a home for red grouse, for curlew, all these sorts of things that are coming in. The Ballydangan bog group, there's employment there. There's sustainable jobs in actually managing the red grouse, the site that we work on with the lads. And then it's about quantifying the benefits. So I just say we're nowhere near on the benefits. We're way over here in terms of establishing the extent and condition. And I've gotten this far, and Jane hasn't given me the nod, so I'll keep moving. So what does that mean? So asset extent. So we all know that peatlands are spread across the Midlands. So just to give you a picture here, we have this lovely map of Ireland, and the yellow bits is the stuff that we have, and this is the derived Irish peatland map developed by our friend and colleague John Connolly in DCU. So I'm going to take an example of one of the bogs that we've looked at in terms of what's there and what sort of condition it's in. So just those of you who've been coming to our Biodiversity Action Days for the last number of years will know that we have a fairly detailed mapping resource in terms of the habitats that we have in our bogs. But we had this baseline mapping, and when the Australians came in and wanted to know, can we use this? They said, this is okay, but because the habitats are so varied and fragmented, we had to translate it into the standard faucet code. I call it faucetization, which is sort of a new word that might creep into the lexicon. So we have our general land use maps, our habitat maps, and we also had our future habitat maps. So what do? We had to basically faucetize the work. So, and also what was advised to me by one of our colleagues in the Society of Ecological Restoration was go back in time as well, map it. What was the habitat then? So what we did was we took 1990, 1980, 2019, 2050. So this is a bog, right? This is a place called Ballycon Bog. Some of you might have been actually out there with us. So back in 1990, we're assuming that it was an active raised bog. There was probably a little bit of fen up here in the corner based on the 1830 series map. So we flash forward, and Bord na Móna did what it's really good at in terms of developing the peatland, bare peat. So we have now a bare peat. So this is PB4I, which is the addition to the PB4 classification. Then we flash forward to 2019. So what status, what habitats are here? So we have poor fen and woodland mosaic, and it's in a pioneer phase. So here we've done our rehab. We've moved into the next phase. And then in the future, so we took 2020, 2050, that we would have a more established fen woodland mosaic. So it's an asset register, asset classification through time. Okay, so this helps us tell the story. It was a bog, it was an industrial bog, it was rehabilitated, and now it's reverting to this habitat. So it's about telling the story. It's as simple as that. And when we can tell the story, we can match the services and the benefits to that habitat type. In terms of condition, and I'll stop here, what I find really interesting is this restorative continuum, which was developed by the Society of Ecological Restoration. It's really good, and I think it was developed by people who actually might have done restoration at the same time and rehabilitation, which is always good. But what you have here is you have a continuum where you have a habitat, the cause of decline or degradation reduces, ecosystem function becomes improved, so that might be a bit of rehabilitation, add a bit of time or maybe a bit of extra management, and then you come along to your target system and you finally get back. And how I see this, us applying this, would be in that we've active peat production out here, then we stop peat production, we do our rehabilitation with our fantastic fleet of dozers and diggers, then we get to this state here where we have native habitats enhanced and hopefully getting further along as time is added, nothing added but time. And then these fantastic things like marsh fertility, and of course we would have a different trajectory for the raised bogs. So what we're talking about from this, that we would have developed condition layers or conditions, conditions that we could talk about in terms of this would have been our intact peatland, our industrial site, rehabilitation happens. So we're gradually going from red into an amber where things stop, activity stops, and then rehabilitation and revegetation. So the pictures would be looking like this, and the pictures tell 1,000 words. So this is where we're going. It's an absolute work in progress. I wanted to share this continuum of restoration today because I'm not sure that everyone in Ireland is aware of it. But when you're talking about habitats and how you're getting along in terms of recovery, it's really important. Why are we doing this? We're transforming the Midlands. This is a good way of talking about that transformation, but also reporting the changes. And I guess what's really important is we're all evolving, that we don't just stay in our silos. We want to talk about how Quilch is doing at their work, how the OPW is doing, that we would start talking the same language and use the same approach to natural capital counting. And happy to talk about it with anybody afterwards.
That's great. Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you for describing so candidly the work that you guys are doing with the SEA. Our next speaker is Jonathan Bell, who's the Project and Policy Manager from the Northern Ireland Environment Link. He's a current member of the Irish Forum on Natural Capital Steering Committee.
Thank you, Jane. Well, good afternoon, folks. And as Jane has pointed out, I'm the Policy Manager at Northern Ireland Environment Link, which is the forum and networking body for the environmental sector in Northern Ireland. At Environment Link, we have a range of policy task forces on an array of different policy issues, from planning through to biodiversity. And one of the groups that we have is called the Economics of Nature, and that is NEIL member organisations who are interested in trying to progress and influence, I suppose, the development of natural capital policy in Northern Ireland. And as part of that group, we were supported by the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs to commission a consultant to undertake some natural capital pilots in Northern Ireland. So this presentation is going to look briefly at the policy background that informed that work, and then look at the studies that were undertaken. So as you're probably all aware, there's quite a strong driving force now in the UK for natural capital policy, very much driven by the UK Natural Capital Committee. And the big driver for that is obviously the UK's 25-year environment plan. And I suppose the very core and basis of that is that when we give the environment its due regard as a natural asset, indeed a key contributor to the overall economy, we'll be more likely to give it the full value it deserves to protect and enhance it. And our pilot studies really came out of, I suppose, a recommendation from the committee, and that was that we need more pioneer projects to move the natural capital agenda from a theoretical, conceptual idea into more practical delivery. And specifically in Northern Ireland, within the draft programme for government, it is still draft given our current political situation. There's explicit recognition of natural capital. So it's protecting and enhancing the stock of natural capital that includes air, land, water, soil, biodiversity, and geological resources is fundamental to a healthy and resilient economy. I should say that I suppose in the conservation and the environmental sector, opinions are still split around the value of the natural capital concept, some feeling it represents a commodification of nature, and I suppose some feeling that it reasserts the dominance of the economy over the environment. And I suppose those folks would argue that we need a fundamental reform of our economic system rather than a natural capital approach. But I tend to work within the system that we have. I don't see a new economic system coming anytime soon. So in that context, I think the natural capital concept and approach has real value. So just a very quick overview, a simplistic overview of the approach that was used by our consultants. Firstly, it was to assess those natural capital assets, identify those assets and create a register, determine what the physical flow of benefits are from those assets, have a look and try and calculate the monetary value of those benefits, calculate then the costs of maintaining these assets, so the management cost, and then comparing those benefits and costs, and that's how we came up with a natural capital balance sheet. 2 sites were chosen, both urban green spaces. One was the Bog Meadows. It's a local nature reserve that is managed by the Ulster Wildlife. It's about 20 hectares in size. It is housing on 3 sides and motorway on the other side. And it's a very important recreational resource. It's got good public access and there's a variety of visitors, and it is adjacent to one of the most socially deprived areas of Belfast. The second case study was a larger site owned by and managed by the National Trust within the Lagan Valley area of outstanding natural beauty, and it's within 5 miles of Belfast city centre. It's quite a diverse land holding on the confluence of the Lagan and the Minnoburn River. There's a range of habitats there. There's more significant grazing there than there would be in Bog Meadows, and the area is surrounded sort of by urban conurbations on the north and then countryside to the south. So this very briefly outlines some of the ecosystem services that were assessed, including carbon sequestration, timber, air quality regulation, agricultural production, greenhouse gas emissions, recreation and physical health. The one that is missing there, quite a significant one, is water purification and I suppose flooding mitigation. That's because there wasn't significant robust data to inform that. So as you can see here, there's some carbon sequestration on both sites, more in Minnoburn. Again, there's timber and wood fuel production, not as significant in Bog Meadows as it would be in Minnoburn. The 2 main losses would be around the agricultural production and the greenhouse gases, and then the 2 most significant values there relate to recreation and physical health. I suppose I should stress that I'm not an environmental economist myself. In our report, we do have a more detailed overview of the methodology that was used to derive these figures, and some of them were based on assumptions and estimates given the availability of relevant data in Northern Ireland. So very broadly, the figures that they came up with were that Bog Meadows delivers close to £1 million worth of public goods and services a year, and that is 50 times the cost for Ulster Wildlife to maintain that site, which is around 20,000. In Minnoburn, there's close to £3 million worth of public goods and services a year, and that's 80 times the cost for the National Trust to maintain the site. So some of the key points that came out of those studies, both these areas are providing significant goods and services to society, and they're heavily used for recreational purposes, and that's probably the main reason why there's so much benefit to society. I suppose, as I've showed earlier, the total benefits are 50 or 80 times greater than the cost of actually maintaining those sites. For a relatively small amount of investment, the public is getting a massive return in terms of public good. And I think what this process has shown, that natural capital accounting is very useful at highlighting the value of the natural environment, which otherwise may remain hidden. So to a policymaker, decision maker, politician, they look at a green space and think, oh, that looks okay, but actually when you show them the real value of that site and the multiple benefits and how a monetary value can be placed on that, it can be quite powerful. And I suppose for me, while the natural capital approaches are very useful at raising awareness of the importance of our natural assets, it hasn't quite translated yet, I think, into the investment in the protection and the restoration of natural heritage that is required. So just looking ahead, what does the future hold for natural capital accounting in Northern Ireland? Well, I suppose in longer term we would like to move towards the development of a natural capital index, as we have in Scotland, and that would be a very important baseline, providing the understanding of nature's contribution to the well-being agenda, and also tracking the changes and the losses and gains in natural capital over time. We also think that these approaches could be integrated into the strategic planning policy and into local development plans. It was encouraging to see in the south here that natural capital has been included as a chapter heading within the document, but I suppose for me it looked a little bit light on how the approach is actually going to be implemented or taken forward. We would also like local authorities to perhaps look at developing an asset register for their area, a condition assessment, and perhaps some opportunity mapping to identify opportunity for enhancing those natural assets. And I suppose from a Northern Ireland PLC perspective, I think it would be quite useful to look at an investment strategy for all of or part of Northern Ireland, and particular plans for certain locations, and that would establish quite a compelling business case for investing in natural capital. So this was really a first stab, a first effort at undertaking something practical around natural capital. We still have some way to go, and we hope to progress this further in the coming months. I suppose the political context is very difficult, I suppose, given that we don't have ministers in place, and therefore decision making is that bit more difficult. But we'll keep trying, and we certainly think that the natural capital approach has real value and real potential. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johnny. It's great to hear about the projects that are going on in the north there. So our final speaker in this session is Eugenie Regan, and Eugenie is the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool Manager at UNEP-WCMC, which is the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre. So Eugenie, you're very welcome.
So firstly, it's an absolute honour to be here today, and thank you, Jane, for inviting us. In fact, it was my colleague Stephen King, who's an economist working at UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre, who was invited. But I was coming anyway, and I was at the start of beginning this work, and I encouraged that we took on an economist or an accountant within UN Environment, because I knew that this was going to be an area that was going to be growing. I'm currently studying accounting in an MBA program in Cambridge University, and what has shocked me and surprised me is how interesting accounting actually is. And so I've titled my talk, and I'm hoping to convince you today, in 10 minutes or less, says Jane, that accounting is not boring. I'm going to illustrate this with a story, and it's a story about the Jesuits in the early 16th century and their approach to double-entry bookkeeping. Who knew that double-entry bookkeeping could be interesting? They were really concerned at the power of numbers, and that we couldn't reduce complex decisions or decisions about how we run our lives, how we run our monasteries, to numbers. So they developed the system of double-entry bookkeeping, and basically what they had is they had a cash box. I'm imagining it was quite large, because I'm imagining it was lots of pieces of paper, etc. And on that cash box they had 2 locks. And the key for one lock was kept by the accountant. They had a different word for accountant in that day. And then the other lock, the key was kept by the priest. And the idea was that the priest would interrogate everything around that decision that couldn't be put in numbers. And that's where rhetoric comes in. So rhetoric is actually not about persuasion, but its origins were around interrogating that which we don't know about. And so there we have it. The Jesuits, rhetoric, and accountants all have something very important in common, and that's the way that we approach accounting and the system that we have now in place. So, we've been talking a lot about the system of national accounts, or SIA. It is an integrated, complete system that enables us to understand significant economic activity. So it is about reducing something to numbers, but so we can understand something very complex and start to interrogate it. Within the system of national accounts, there is the system of environmental economic accounting, and basically it's acknowledgement that significant economic activity is absolutely fundamentally linked with the environment. So that's an extremely exciting point that we've got to, where the UN and all the countries around the world are acknowledging that we need to take the environment into account, and we need to take it into account in our standard national accounting approaches. And then the experimental ecosystem accounting fits under that, and experimental because we're still experimenting with how to do it properly, and I think some of the talks really illustrated that we're really at the beginning of how to do this properly. So how does biodiversity sit within the SIA EEA? Basically, they've called it biodiversity species accounts or biodiversity accounts, and it's about assessing the conservation status, ecosystem condition and functioning, and ecosystem services. And this is what our three speakers previously have talked about. Within the SIA thematic accounts, we've got land, carbon, water, and biodiversity, so that's how it fits in. And basically, the steps are you scope, you understand the extent of your biodiversity, you understand the condition of it, you understand the ecosystem services, and supply and use of those, and then the integration. So this bit here is about integrating this within the system of national accounts, and then input to analysis and policy making. So the second part, the key to that cash box, not just about the numbers, but then using those numbers to interrogate what we can't put down into numbers. This here shows how the three different types of accounts within biodiversity accounting are, or what they are specifically. We have the species accounts here, and literally we go species 1, species 2, species 3. We've got ecosystem service accounts, and we've got the ecosystem asset accounts. And these lines show how they're all interacting with each other, as we as ecologists know all too well, but also that they interact specifically with the economy here. And Stephen's slide was much more complex than that, so I've reduced it right down. This is the simple version. This began when I joined UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre in 2013, and we got invited to a meeting by the UN Statistics Division in New York, and I was sent along. It was both the most interesting and the most boring meeting I've ever been to in my life. Boring because we were trying to get our head around something very complex, and it was the first time we ever really thought about this. And exciting because it was the tip of something that really has gained with a lot of momentum internationally now. And one of the things that we did when I came back is we developed a global map of natural capital or key ecosystem assets, which helped us really start to think about this. We then looked at experimental biodiversity accounting as a component of SIA, basically a feasibility study, as Catherine was saying. And then we looked at exploring approaches for constructing those species accounts. Since then, there's been species accounts for Peru and for Victoria in Australia. The Australians are very far ahead of this. They've been involved in this from the very get-go, and someone mentioned Carl Obst. And then WCMC was working, had the opportunity to work with Uganda and develop experimental ecosystem accounts for Uganda. And I'll dive into a few of what's come out of that. But one of the big challenges within it is that national accounts are normally, we know, GDP, the Central Statistics Office look also at population, and they start at the very small scale, and they aggregate all the information up to the national scale. But that's very difficult to do when we're talking about biodiversity and ecosystems, although it seems to be successful in some of the examples that we've shown here. So another option is to look from a top-down approach and capture biodiversity between the locations and simplify the accounting. So there's two different ways of doing it, and there's lots of complexity about how we do it. But here are some of the practical things that were done in Uganda, and this looks very similar to the maps that were presented by the other speakers as well. So this was how they thought, okay, we'll divide up into sub-regions because this is how we do our national accounts in Uganda anyway. They also looked, well, what is the protected area estate in Uganda? And that was some of the basic information that they could start with and start to build their accounts on the basis of that. And then this is a really interesting practical example where they looked at something specific, which was shea butter nut trees. Lots of hand creams contain shea butter, and it's very valuable to Uganda. And they said, okay, what is our opening stock and what is our closing stock? So you can see here that they looked at the opening stock in 1990, the extent of habitat, the closing stock in 2015, and then of that stock that they have, how much of it is protected. So this is the type of detail that we can go into. It's the type of information we can have that then we can communicate around how is biodiversity faring and how is this impacting, say, on the economic activity of a country. So at the moment, countries developing ecosystem accounts, and this is, I think, a really exciting list of countries. We've got Brazil, India, China, South Africa, and Mexico, all large countries with very high biodiversity and with large economic activity as well. So it's not the easy wins in terms of who's doing this. So I want to go back to the Jesuits, because I think there is the point made about George Monbiot and his criticism of what we're doing. Back to the point of we are not reducing to numbers to stay at numbers. Don't forget about the augmentation. We tend to stop at the numbers rather than understanding what the numbers are helping us to say. And I'd like to pick up on what Ella McSweeney said earlier today. She said that people are affected by stories, not figures and facts. And Catherine said it was all about telling a story. That's exactly what accounts were built for and accounting was built for from when they were first started. So let's not forget the origins of accounting and what accounting is actually for. Reducing to numbers so we can then augment and have a discussion and interrogation of what these actually mean for our economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eugenie, and thank you for leaving us on that positive note. I'd like to invite the four speakers to join me on the stage, please. I think it's been really useful to hear some examples of what's currently happening, and I think it's really also, for me personally, it's very heartening to see the progress that has been made in this area over the last 3 or 4 years. And certainly, as Catherine mentioned, when we first started talking about natural capital in Ireland maybe 4 or 5 years ago, this seemed like an awful long way off. So it's great to see that we are making this progress and we're getting there. So I'd like to open the discussion to the floor. I think there might be some questions pop up on the screen. I'm not sure how that's that's going to happen. Okay, so we'll take some questions from the floor first, and before we go to the questions from Slido. So does anybody want to start with a question or a comment to any of the speakers? Okay, so we start. Amy? And please, can you wait for the microphone when you have a question so that everyone can hear?
A question probably for Catherine, but maybe for the others as well. When you start looking at your asset register, I'm interested on board Mona, if I picked you up correctly, went back to 1900.
Yes.
So how important is it to start with a point in the past? In other words, to make up for the damage that has been done. You can't obviously go back to day one, but how do you pick your logical starting point?
Well, am I on? So basically, the story of peatland use in Ireland goes back to the 1600s. So I suppose Bord na Móna was born out of an activity that began in the noughties, their noughties, and formalised really in the 30s. So 1900 seemed like a good starting point for us. Like at that point, you would have had, boundary drains already inserted, and my colleague Mark McCorry has done an awful lot of the mapping here and looking back in the detail of what was actually happening on the sites. So the bogs essentially were already drained, and some had canals cut through them. So, like in telling the story of condition, we weren't at the top condition level, which would be condition 5, which probably was back in 1600 or 1700. We were starting actually from a condition 4, and we were comfortable enough that we could start our story there. Now, in between times, to get to 1980 would have been the peak peat production. So we picked that in that all of the bogs would have been drained, whatever was going to be drained, because it was a purchase time or a CPO time in the 70s when the oil crisis was there, and Ireland was getting money from the EU to buy bogs. So from that point on, we were happy enough. We probably peak peat, and then today we know that 2019 we have, you know, certain areas are still in peat production, certain areas are rehabilitated. So this is the right time to pick as well. So just adapting it to our story and the peatland story in general, and I think what people will relate to, you know. So that's what it's where it's at. It seems to work.
Thank you, Catherine. And maybe I could open that to some of the other speakers in terms of looking at changes over time. What are the appropriate timeframes that we can use?
I think I was speaking to Carl Obbs there last year at one of the Irish Forum on Natural Capital events, and his argument was basically just start now. Don't worry about the time, get whatever you can get and work from there. So start from today. Don't worry about going back to 1900. We'd love to have that data, it'd be brilliant, but what can we get today and go forward?
Great, thank you. Marianne? Oh, no, if you can use the microphone, please, because we're also streaming this so that people can hear the discussion.
Thank you. Just a question, I'm from Dublin City Council, just a question for Jonathan about the site selection for the two sites. So I'm very interested in the fact that you were looking at valuing urban green spaces, but I'm just wondering, because the sites you selected, one of them was already a nature reserve, so there's inherently going to be a value assigned to that by society and how people manage it. And equally the National Trust, you know, there's certain shared values by the owners. Did you look at ordinary kind of loved but also abused urban green spaces, or is that the next step now?
Yeah, it was quite a process trying to sort of narrow down which sites we would go with, and I suppose it came down to the members involved in our working group, how readily available data would be, and I suppose that was two of the primary reasons that we went for the two sites that we did. But I totally agree with your point. There's absolute scope for trying to include other sites that aren't in maybe such good condition or aren't recognised for their nature value, and that's something we would maybe like to try and do going forward. Because I agree with the point, trying to show the value of some spaces that are perceived to be, well, that's just a wasteland or that's just a bog. Well, actually, no, it's delivering real value, and trying to reveal that hidden value is really, really important. So, no, I agree with your point.
Peter Cuthbert, planning consultant. If the examples showed that the cost of maintenance was much lower, the benefit was much lower than the maintenance, but it can be a two-edged sword. If your analysis shows on areas of lands that the cost of maintenance is much higher than the benefit, does that open up the opportunity to a local authority to say, well, this is non-viable land, we should build on it?
Yeah, it's a good point. Certainly we were fortunate from the studies that we chose and the work that we undertook that wasn't the case, but I'm not sure. I suppose if you undertook studies on other sites, would that be the case? It is a possibility, but I suppose then there's also the intrinsic value of nature, and we have to always tap into that point as well, that it's not just purely about the number crunching. So there are other justifications and ways of justifying the continued investment in those particular sites.
John Armstrong, just to add on to that point as well, I was wondering, even for the site that you gave, if a company was to come in and say we will give you more money than that site currently provides, is there a worry then that by looking at it this way, kind of give a rationale for that to happen?
Absolutely, it's something that came out of our study. We thought, well, if a developer came in and said he wanted to build 1,000 apartments there, I don't think you're going to be able to compete on that front, and that's just the facts. But that doesn't mean that these particular sites shouldn't be valued for the public services they do deliver. And I suppose that's where I have a slight hesitation at times that in a planning context, I think it sometimes could be difficult to apply the natural capital approach where you have maybe big developer interests. And if you just simply pit the environment against sort of construction, I think the national environment argument would struggle to win out.
Yep, Mel.
I'm Mel Austin from Plymouth Marine Laboratory, also on the UK Natural Capital Committee, so I suppose I had to intervene at this moment. I mean, under the 25-year environment plan, which doesn't apply necessarily to Northern Ireland, there is the principle of net gain. So in that situation, if a developer did want to develop, they would have to still ensure that there was net environmental gain. So actually you could end up with something better if, you know, a better environment set up, theoretically. But I think it would be a sort of kind of a bit of a holdback for a developer, that they would have to think about, well, what net environment gain they're going to replace it with.
That's a valuable point, yeah. I think there's a danger. I think there are some concerns, certainly from stakeholders in Northern Ireland, that net environmental gain could result in offsetting and the loss of some really precious habitats. So I think that was also a concern that's arisen.
Eugenie.
I was just going to say as well that obviously there's a range of approaches within accounting, but the money valuation of our stock and assets is a one part of the process. Most of the process is actually just understanding what we have and what state it's in, and actually you don't need to value it at all. So the monetary valuation, so when I showed the shea butter example, they didn't monetize that. They just looked at how much shea butter trees they had versus how much they used to have. And how could they improve the stock, because it's an invaluable asset to them. But they didn't put a monetary valuation to it. So just that we don't, that's not.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I'd like to go to the questions that we have here, because I can see lots of thumbs up against the top question, so obviously people would like it answering. So the top question here is that this is all very fascinating, but leaving biodiversity and habitat loss out of the equation surely omits a central purpose of natural capital accounting. Why not build them in? So I don't know if that's directed at a particular speaker.
That was directed at Luke, sorry.
Luke?
Yeah,
sorry.
Okay, so ideally what I'd love to have is those sort of figures that Jonathan provided for all of this stuff over the time frame that Catherine's talking about. So I'd love to have those figures available. They just don't exist. So what's the value in what I'm doing there is, what I'm saying, well, do you think that habitat loss, biodiversity, etc., would be worth 15-20% of GNI or not? Okay, so that's a fairly open question. If so, that would turn that genuine savings measure negative. If not, it wouldn't.
But you could also build in other equations, that if biodiversity, for example, and biodiversity restoration in particular, is actually leading to lowering greenhouse gas emissions, then you'd also be reducing pollutants. So I think leaving it out, actually, I mean, I thought it was a fascinating exercise with surprising results, but now I'm completely skeptical of the results if those essential elements are left out.
And I'm actually going to skip over the second question and go to the third one, because I'm conscious of sticking to the theme of this session. So should, where is it there? Sorry, it moved. What are the major data gaps blocking natural capital accounting, and how might they be filled? And I think this is, you know, one of the key things that everybody mentioned was data gaps. So I don't know who'd like to take that one.
Well, I'll just comment on our experience in terms of the mapping, and conscious that we're working a bit in a bubble, you know, and we're going at this with our own approach. I think there's probably data gaps, but that if we could all sort of talk together about how we're approaching it and come up with one standardized approach. In terms of the data gaps, we have, like, you know, the ecology team has done fantastic work, and we have the maps. We know exactly what's on every half hectare of bog that we have. So we have that data, but I don't think that's available for Ireland. And so but the other stuff we don't have would be species data. You know, you were talking about that approach, that the species are difficult, and the Australians were a bit frustrated with us for not having that level of information as well. So there's probably a lot, but I think a baseline habitat map for Ireland would be a fantastic starting point that not only would be required for this, but all the stuff we heard about in the catchments meeting earlier on, and the rivers and the communities and blah, blah, blah. So I think that's the information gap to me would seem.
I think what is really interesting is that John Brannigan said we don't do enough to talk across disciplines, and this is about a separate discipline now having a demand for our data. If we go back to economics and supply demand, so if there's going to be more and more demand for biodiversity data, then there's going to be an onus on us to provide it, and hopefully there would be some financing there as well. I know there are many financing mechanisms for supply of biodiversity data. So yes, there are gaps, but by doing this and by creating a demand for the data, we're only going to make things better.
Great, thank you. And I'm very conscious of time, so I think that's a good point to leave this session on, is that we are at the beginning of this process, and that absolutely it's interdisciplinary, and we're working together, often outside our comfort zones, in order to progress this. So I'd like to thank very much our 4 excellent speakers this afternoon. Thank you to those of you. Thank you to those of you who had questions so we didn't have time to deal with. There's now a coffee break, but I've had 3 different people come to me and say, please, please, please go downstairs, see the exhibitions. So downstairs in this building is an exhibition hall of various projects and NGOs that are patiently waiting to tell people about what they're doing. So please, network, find someone you've never met before, take them downstairs, go to the exhibition hall, and then enjoy your coffee. Thank you.